Today's story is about a woman in New York in the years just after the Civil War. From the outside, she may already seem a bit unusual. She's a successful immigrant businesswoman, running a dry goods store and hosting elaborate dinner parties where cops and politicians rub shoulders with the city's elite. But behind closed doors, she's building an empire that would make modern crime bosses jelly. A genius of organization, a mentor to criminals, and dubbed the Queen of Fences, she would go on to handle millions in stolen goods and run a school for aspiring thieves, all while keeping herself just out of reach of the law. This is the story of Fredericka Marm Mandelbaum, the woman who became one of the most influential criminal masterminds of the Gilded Age and the head of the most notorious crime syndicate of the era. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Marm might sound a little familiar to you. She's been a supporting character in several stories we've told over the last 2 seasons, but I thought she was important enough to get her own whole episode. Women's rights. Before we continue, have you liked, subscribed, and maybe shared this podcast with a friend? You know you want to. We've got bigger and better things planned for this season. More cocktails, more capers. Well, like exactly the same, but different ones. Friends make sure friends have good cocktail recipes and good capers to listen to. Come on, cocktail conspirators. You know it's true. Head to follow us on all the social medias, too. Born around 1825 in Prussia, which is now part of Germany, we don't really know much about Fredericka Weitzel's early life. She came from a Jewish family, but we don't have much reliable information about her parents or siblings. This gap in knowledge about her early years is actually pretty typical for many immigrants of that era, especially women. Records weren't always well kept, and many people's early histories get lost in the transition from the old world to the new. Prussia in the early 1800s, particularly around when Fredericka would have been growing up there in the 1820s and 1830s, was going through some changes that likely shaped her early experiences. Jewish families like hers lived under what was known as the Prussian Jews' Edict of 1812. While this edict technically gave citizenship to Jewish people, in practice they faced tons of restrictions. They couldn't have government jobs. They had limited places they could live, and often they had to live in specific neighborhoods. Most Jewish families in Prussia at that time were either merchants or peddlers, since many traditional professions they actually couldn't get a job in. Given that Fredericka later showed such business savvy in New York, she might have grown up in a trading family and learned business skills from an early age. Education for Jewish girls in Prussia at this time was typically focused on domestic skills and basic literacy, though some more progressive families did provide their daughters with broader education. While we don't know for sure about Fredericka's education, she was clearly literate and numerate. Given her business activities later, she could work with numbers. The 1840s, when Fredericka would have been in her early 20s, saw a big increase in anti-Semitism and political unrest in Prussia. The 1848 revolutions that swept through German states created additional instability that prompted many to seek opportunities elsewhere. They were also, like Ireland, undergoing great economic instability and a potato famine of their own. Just no potatoes for anyone. Fredericka, like many other Jewish Prussians, chose to immigrate to America. She married Wolf Mandelbaum, or maybe Wolf, I don't know. I like Wolf, a fellow German Jewish immigrant in 1848, and the two of them worked as itinerant peddlers before immigrating to the United States, specifically New York City in 1850 with their infant daughter, Bertha. They would join thousands of other lower-class immigrants for a 6-week passage in steerage, where conditions were they were bad. They were pretty bad. Hundreds of passengers were crammed into dark, poorly ventilated spaces that were downright disgusting and often dangerous, and really smelly. The Mandelbaum family initially settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in what eventually would be known as Little Germany. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was one of the most densely populated places in the whole world. It was full of crowded tenement buildings that housed immigrant families in little tiny apartments, often without proper ventilation or plumbing. These walk-up buildings, typically 5 to 6 stories tall, would house up to 20 families, with each apartment around 325 square feet, housing families of 6 or more in 300 square feet. These apartments did not have proper ventilation or running water, and disease spread rapidly due to the overcrowded conditions. Early tenements had only shared outhouses in the backyard, so they were often literally overflowing with poop, and the streets were filled with garbage. Baby Bertha died of a disease likely caused by the conditions in which they lived during that time. Fredericka and Wolf would go on to have 4 more children. When they first arrived in New York, Fredericka and Wolf began a series of small businesses, first as peddlers. Using their profits, they leased a 2-story building on the corner of Clinton and Rivington Streets and opened a dry goods shop. The shop was at street level, and Fredericka, Wolf, and eventually their 4 children lived above on the 2nd floor. This might have been a story of a woman with an entrepreneurial spirit who lived the American dream at a small individual level. But Fredericka, who would soon become to everyone, including law enforcement and the press, Mother, Ma, or as we will call her, Marm, instead decided to become a criminal mastermind and the country's most notorious fence. And why was she the mother to the seedy underbelly of New York City? Well, she would say, quote, "I am Ma because I give them what a mother cannot sometimes give, money, horses, and diamonds," end quote. But before we get into all that, shall we have a drink? The Red Snapper is our cocktail for today, and it's actually the original version of what's now more commonly known as the Bloody Mary. Legend tells us that the drink was first created in the 1920s by Pete Petiot in Paris. When Petiot moved to New York's St. Regis Hotel in 1934, he brought the recipe with him. However, the St. Regis Hotel felt that the name Bloody Mary was too vulgar for their sophisticated clientele, so they renamed it the Red Snapper. The original Red Snapper was made with vodka, tomato juice, and various seasonings. Bloody Mary. At the time in the U.S., vodka was not as readily available or popular as it is today, so gin was sometimes used as a substitute. Today, some bars do still serve Red Snappers as gin-based alternatives to the vodka-based Bloody Mary, though the terms are sometimes used, interchangeably. If you missed last week's episode, just a friendly note that this season we're trying something different and we're not actually stirring up the drinks during the episode or shaking up the drinks. But I would never let you down, so please do not fret. As always, the cocktails will be in the description box and the mocktail version for those of you who are not drinking. But if you want to talk more about the drink, we have Thirsty Thursday over on Clock app. Every week, I make a video with the cocktail and mocktail TikTok of the week. And don't forget, the ingredients and the recipe are in the description box. You have no excuse not to treat yourself, okay? That's all I have to say. In September of 1857, a hurricane in the Atlantic sunk a very important ship, the SS Central America. Going down with the ship was approximately 30,000 pounds of gold, worth about $2 million that was supposed to go to New York banks. This loss came at a critical time and helped trigger what's called the Panic of 1857, one of America's first major financial crises. Since the country operated under the gold standard, the loss of such a large gold shipment had immediate effects. Banks in New York and throughout the Northeast couldn't meet their obligations, leading to a chain reaction of bank failures and business bankruptcies. The Panic of 1857 and its resulting economic depression led to increased crime in New York City, especially in the form of pickpockets and petty thieves, my favorite. Folks were losing their jobs at a rapid rate, but they still had to live, so people started stealing to make ends meet. And Marm, ever the entrepreneur, wanted in on the game. Apparently, without much input from her husband, everybody with me now, Wolf, Marm decided that she would get in on the second half of the criminal enterprise, the buying of stolen goods and then the reselling of those goods. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what fencing is, if you didn't know. Fence is slang I learned from the 17th century. They shortened the word defense. It is used to describe a professional dealer in stolen goods who acts as a middleman to protect thieves from detection. Defense them. A fence typically buys stolen items at a fraction of their true value and then resells them at prices below retail, but high enough to make a profit. It's not really known why Marm jumped into the fencing game, but we do know that by 1859, she had already apprenticed herself to 2 master fences in Little Germany, who taught her how to find the best goods, how to find the products that people would want to buy, and what to price those goods at in her store to go fast. You got to get it out of there fast so people don't see it's stolen. Her preferred items were bolts of silk and diamonds, which she could acquire for cheap and sell for a huge profit. However, she would basically take anything that was worth cold hard cash. Author J. North Conway would write, quote, "Following the Great Chicago Fire, someone showed up at her haberdashery shop with a herd of goats they'd stolen during the fire, and she took them," end quote. Did they bring them all the way from Chicago? I don't know. She was in New York. Anyway, Marm had a dry goods store, remember? It was ready to be filled. Buy low and sell high, am I right? And remember, times were tough. Marm could help, though. She charged way below retail prices. She could, after all, since her distributors were getting their inventory with a little 5-finger discount. This was the very beginning of her 30-year criminal operation. 30 years! But if Marm was only a fence, we may never have known her name. Marm, however, was more than a fence. She was a master at building connections and forging relationships with those in the seedy underbelly of New York City, as well as those who worked, well, slightly above the underbelly, the overbelly. She made friends with criminals as far north as Canada, as well as politicians and police officers all around the city of New York. Marm was known to grease the wheels with straight, hard cash when she needed to. And let's be honest here, it was a time in New York's history when that was really all that was needed to get anyone to turn a blind eye to what a criminal was doing. And a lot of that had to do with Boss Tweed. Yeah, Boss Tweed, the big cheese of Tammany Hall in New York during the 1860s and early 1870s. We probably should do a Boss Tweed episode. Anyway, he practically wrote the book on political corruption. He used his position to control city politics, stuffing his own pockets with millions through kickbacks, fake contracts, and rigged elections. Never mind. Tweed made sure his cronies got rich too, keeping them loyal while leaving the city's finances in shambles. His downfall came when political cartoonists and investigative journalists exposed his schemes, leading to a public outcry that finally brought him down. But while he was in power, Marm essentially had free rein to run her schemes. And run them she did. Marm's husband, Wolf, died in 1871. But that didn't seem to stop Marm because, remember, she was really doing most of this on her own anyway. Police Chief George Washington Walling would say about Marm, quote, "The woman took the lead in these nefarious transactions. She was a thorough businesswoman. Her husband was a non-entity," end quote. Okay, Marm rose in prominence for several decades. She was world famous, even before radio and television. She had risen in celebrity and wealth, and somehow she was able to do all of this basically in the open without getting caught. Well, I think we know why she wasn't getting caught. Anyway, she was big news in the newspapers of that day. They wrote stories about her lavish dinner parties with the above and below board, making her table bursting, about her fancy dresses, and about the diamonds she draped herself in. And they wrote about her crimes, especially those that involved some of the foremost freelance criminals of the day who worked with and for Marm. She really was their mother from another mother. She put many of them on salary, and she cared for them. She called them her chicks. She bailed them out when they got arrested. She advanced them money when they needed it, before a heist. She would supply getaway horses and carriages for their burglaries. George Leonidas Leslie, the king of bank robbers, was a suave architect turned master thief who became one of the most successful bank robbers during his time. Known for his meticulous planning, he would spend I'm not kidding, years studying vaults, blueprints, and security systems before pulling off a heist. He often collaborated with Marm for resources and hideouts. Despite his criminal genius, his life ended abruptly. His body was found near Yonkers in 1878, sparking rumors of betrayal within his own crew. We talked about him in a previous season, if you haven't listened and you'd like to. Oh, and speaking of a previous season, Marm also worked with the Napoleon of crime, Adam Worth. Adam Worth was a mastermind thief and con artist who inspired the character of Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes, which I've never read, but I probably should. Known for his gentlemanly demeanor, he orchestrated daring heists, including stealing a painting, the Duchess of Devonshire. Adam's criminal empire stretched across continents. Adam would use Marm as a fence to offload his stolen items and also for financial backing for some of his more ambitious schemes. Expanding her operations, Marm started a school known as Marm's Grand Street School to recruit and teach younger criminals how to pickpocket. One of the pickpockets Marm worked with was Sophie Lyons. Sophie was a legendary pickpocket and con artist who started her criminal career as a child, learning the ropes from her notorious family. She was known for her charm and quick wit, which helped her pull off elaborate scams and evade capture time and again. Sophie typically ran her own scams, but occasionally relied on Marm for fencing stolen goods, and many called Sophie Marm's special protege. Marm also controlled several gangs of blackmailers and confidence men. A confidence man, or as you probably know it, a con man, is a person who manipulates others into trusting them to commit fraud or swindle them out of money or valuables, like Adam Worth. One thing to note about Marm is that her crimes were almost completely and totally nonviolent. Those of you who did happen to listen to the episode on George know that there was one robbery that went wrong and one person was murdered. In her 25-year career, that was the only time that anyone got hurt or killed that we know of. But Marm did not go her entire career without facing consequences. In 1884, Peter B. Olney, New York City's new district attorney, was determined to take down Marm, despite her long history of bribing the local cops. Instead of relying on the corrupt police force, he hired, let's hear it, everybody, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. We should do an episode on them. And they ran a sting. One of their detectives, Gustav Frank, went undercover as a guy named Stein and eventually bought some marked silks from Marm. Her arrest in the case got tons of attention from the New York press, as you can imagine. They were fascinated by her fall from grace, as they were from her grace, I guess. At the time, Marm had two top lawyers, William F. Howe and Abraham Hummel, on retainer for $5,000 a year. That's a lot of money. I didn't do the math. That's a lot of money. They fought for her innocence, trying to discredit Gustav by painting him as nothing more than a criminal. The irony here, of course, is that the person they were representing was actually, in fact, the criminal. Well, when the time came for Marm to show up in court, she was a no-show, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence as her lawyers were forced to admit that she'd skipped town, mumbling, quote, "The defendants are not here, Your Honor," end quote. The next day, Marm was found in Canada by the New York Times. At the time, there was no extradition treaty between Canada and the United States, so Marm was able to stay there, free from justice. She lived the rest of her life there, despite expressing regret over leaving New York, once telling a reporter, quote, "I am sorry that I ever left New York. I should have faced the music," end quote. While it's hard to pin down an exact figure, it's estimated that Marm Mandelbaum made millions through her criminal empire. She was known to have a steady stream of income from high-profile heists, including bank robberies and art thefts. At her peak, she was said to be worth around $10 million or $330 million $2025, though her wealth was often hidden and, of course, went up and down, fluctuated depending on the success of her operations. Marm Mandelbaum's exact cause of death isn't entirely clear, but it's widely believed that she died of natural causes, likely related to old age. She passed away in 1894 at the age of 72. Her death generated another wave of headlines, with some reports suggesting that she was not actually dead and that her coffin was just full of rocks. Other sources reported that several pockets were picked at the cemetery. Her New York Times obituary would read, quote, "Her success was in a great measure due to her friendship for and her loyalty to the thieves with whom she did business. She never betrayed her clients, and when they got into trouble, she procured bail for them and befriended them to the extent of her power," end quote. Thanks for hanging out with me. Imagine defying the odds of the 19th century when it came to women and doing it by A, being an absolute top-rate criminal, B, using your relationships to build an empire, and C, managing to pull the strings behind the scenes so that you can thrive in a corrupt, chaotic world. And in 25 years, only one person even gets hurt. I'm not saying I'm a criminal, but if I were, I'd like to be a criminal like Marm Mandelbaum. In 2 weeks, we're leaping forward into almost modern times and to a man who either is a magnificent, misunderstood artist or a man who wants to watch the world burn. Either way, there will be plenty of toilets involved. I'll see you in 2 weeks, and remember, there are always alternatives to being the queen of fences in 19th century New York City, but why would you want the alternatives?